Hello, and welcome to the fourth Optimism Quarterly webinar with Token Relations. I am Jacquelyn Melinek, the co-founder of Token Relations, and joining me today for a fireside chat is Levand, head of governance. And for those who may be new, Optimism is a collective of companies, communities, and citizens working together to reward public goods and build a sustainable future for Ethereum. There is the Superchain ecosystem, which is a network of L2s built on Optimism's OP stack, including chains like Base, Unichain, Sonium, Inc., and World, among many others. And today we'll be exploring Optimism's Governance Season 7, its two-party system, retro funding, the Futurarchy experiment, which was introduced recently, and more. Excited to speak with you about everything. So happy to have you here. How's it going?
Yeah, good morning. Happy to be here and talk about Optimism Governance.
Yeah. Given your role as the head of governance, can you kind of give us a quick overview of what Optimism's governance looks like today, and then we could go from there?
Sure. And for people that aren't familiar, what we mean when we say Optimism Governance, it's just the decision-making structure that will be used for this collective of companies to basically to make decisions together in the collective interest. So it's the way that we make decisions as a collective is what we mean when we're talking about Optimism Governance. We're taking an approach basically to that we call progressive decentralization. And so we're a few years into what will be a multi-year transition from the Optimism Foundation and OP Labs kind of making all decisions about the protocol and the ecosystem ourselves to a collective of builders basically involved in the ecosystem making those decisions together. So right now, all of the OP Stack protocol upgrades go through our governance system, so they have to be approved by people other than OP Labs basically. And then there's a treasury basically that is a shared resource, and decisions about that treasury also need to go through the kind of collective decision-making process or our governance system. There are more decisions that we will kind of transfer over to the collective over the next couple of years, as we're also gradually putting more of this functionality on chain. And that just makes it so that it's very transparent and everybody can actually see on chain how we're managing these resources. But we're going slowly and it's a gradual process so that we can make that transition kind of safe and effective.
Mm-hmm. What do you think would make the Optimism governance model kind of unique compared to other chains or ecosystems that have governance going on today as well, where, it's very community led, sometimes it's like token led, or voted via tokens? What makes Optimism's different?
Yeah, I think we have two main differences in the approach that we're taking. As you said, most governance systems are dependent on token weighted voting. So that just means that there's one vote per token. So if I own a lot of tokens, I have a lot of votes. And so the power can become very unevenly distributed in that system. Basically, just like the more tokens I have, the more control I have over that system. And sometimes I gain like full control over that system.
Okay.
And so we have like a system that has two different voting mechanisms to balance that out and basically prevent any one token holder from being able to make unilateral decisions about the system. So we have token weighted voting like you see everywhere, but we also have a part of the collective, which is a one member, one vote system. And there's a system of checks and balances so that either voting mechanism can't make decisions that are not in the interest of the whole. That's really what we're trying to achieve with this design, is that the decisions that are made are in the collective interest and not in any one individual participant's interest. That's what we have to achieve. The second thing that's different in our approach is around resource allocation. And so governance systems of all kinds, not just the crypto kind, are pretty inefficient historically at allocating resources in a way that accomplishes strategic goals like efficiently, basically. And so we have this concept called retro funding that we think will dramatically change the collective's ability to kind of allocate resources more efficiently. And how we go about accomplishing that is that we do a small amount of predicting what will be useful and making grants in advance. And that is basically like, I give you these tokens up front because you've made a promise to do something and I believe that you're going to do it. But the majority of our system will run on what we call retroactive funding, which is that you've already done some work and it's been valuable. And now we try to understand and kind of quantify the impact and reward you for that after the fact. And the idea is that it's much easier to understand what has been useful than to guess what will be useful. And so the majority of our system is meant to run in that way, and we're working towards that, but it's a big difference. A lot of other governance systems have started to experiment with retroactive funding, kind of partially based on the work that we're doing, but I don't think there are any other systems where that's meant to kind of be the main resource allocation mechanism.
Mhm. When it comes to these other systems, maybe outside of Optimism, what are you kind of observing with these ecosystems across the board? Do you think it's important for them to be fully decentralized community governed entities? Why or why not, especially within this ecosystem? I know beyond like the blockchain sector, the governance and everything, as you mentioned before, like voting could be very different, but within the sphere of like truly decentralized blockchains, I'm of the camp that you're probably going to say yes, they should, but I'm curious your thoughts.
I think that we have, as an industry, like I'm friends with, and I know many of the other people that have my job at other protocols, basically, and we talk a lot to try to share learnings and figure this out together, because in many ways, a lot of this has not been done before. And I think that what we're seeing is that we'll have to become more clear and more nuanced about when and where decentralization matters. I think in the past, DAOs were just like, decentralize absolutely every decision. And you don't necessarily need that level of decentralization to achieve the properties that you're trying to achieve with decentralization, which is basically just that you don't have unilateral control over the protocol, the treasury, or important decisions, and that you don't have single points of failure. But it also doesn't mean that you need 20 million people to be involved in making, even the smallest decisions. And so I think we'll start to see a lot more nuance around, well, how do we actually define decentralization? Where in the system does it really matter? And then where it's not really achieving what it's meant to achieve, you might see like more centralized decision making happening. And then what's important in that context is just that you have the level of transparency and viable alternatives necessary to have accountability for those decision makers. That's also like the difference between like a public company structure. You can compare a DAO to either a government or a public company, and it's like somewhere in the middle. So public companies have a lot of centralized decision making, but at the end of the day, shareholders can replace the leadership, basically, whether it's the CEO or the board. But there's not a lot of that accountability is very limited in a lot of ways. So I think that you could have some areas of the system where you have a party that has more leeway to make decisions, but then you need to increase the amount of accountability and transparency around that party. So I think it's a long way to answer, but I think that we will start to see more clarity around the parts of the system that really require decentralization, and then it should absolutely be there. But then there's other parts of the system that probably benefit from more centralized decision making, so long as the centralized decision makers are actually held accountable and not just like accountability in theory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think the comparison between like public markets and those types of companies where they have shareholders and what's going on with DAOs and governance models within blockchain ecosystems actually is a really good comparison. With Optimism's governance model, how does it kind of help shape the broader Superchain ecosystem with its shared governance? And then how does it kind of enable these OP chains to grow and innovate and also feel secure within the community?
Yeah. Optimism governance is, I think, really important in the context of the Superchain strategy. Because what you have to do in the Superchain strategy is create incentives to collaborate, where historically there have been incentives to compete. And so part of the way that you can do that is by ensuring that all of the main kind of participants and contributors to the Superchain ecosystem and vision are represented in decision making. So it's not that one chain can make dramatic decisions that impact another chain, and the other chain doesn't have a voice or a say or an influence in that process. So that's a really kind of important part of the Superchain strategy. And then the way that the chains look at it is, what does this governance system kind of like allow them to accomplish? Basically, does it enable them to achieve their strategic outcomes that they need to? So one thing from my perspective, which the chains probably don't think about as much, is that it does allow for these kind of collaborative incentives. But it also allows for them to grow their ecosystem, because what Optimism Governance governs is the resources that are shared among everyone in the Superchain, being the OP stack and this treasury. The reason the treasury is shared is because if you're part of the Superchain, you contribute part of your revenue back to that treasury. And so if you're contributing revenue to that treasury, you probably care what happens with that treasury. And so that treasury is often used to provide growth incentives across the Superchain, right? So it's not limited to one chain. It's like all chains in the Superchain or that meet certain requirements are eligible to receive retro funding or grants or kind of any other incentive coming out of that shared treasury that they're contributing to. The second thing is innovation around the OP stack. And of course, if you use the OP stack, you benefit from that innovation. But by being part of the governance system, you can actually have influence like over the core development process and which upgrades are approved and how they get approved. You can also benefit from like the larger ecosystem of developers and builders that are part of the ecosystem and that get incentives and that we make grants across the Superchain for. And then the third outcome people care about is security. And I kind of look at that in two senses. One is security of the protocol, and we have a stage 1 security council, and we also have incident response supports. But the second part is also just security over the decisions that get made and over the treasury. So you'll see at a lot of DAOs that just have token weighted voting, some party, and it can be an external party, it's not even someone within the ecosystem, can come get a lot of tokens and then are all of a sudden in charge, and there's nothing kind of anybody can do about it. And so we are putting a lot of effort into designing a system that's secure against those types of attacks.
You also mentioned revenue before. Do you see that as a driver for incentivizing Superchains to include their own communities in decision making? Like, is that one of the main drivers, or are there other ways that you think about this?
It's a really good question. So the model that we're trying to create, I'm from the US, so it's easier for me to think in analogies to the US government. So you can think of it as federal and state. And so Optimism Governance is, in a way, the kind of federal level governance where you're governing
the OP chains.
Yeah, the shared, and the states are the OP chains, exactly. And so at the federal level, you govern like the shared resources, which is the shared treasury and the protocol and like the collective strategy or like North Star that you're optimizing for. At the state level or at the chain level, they govern basically everything that is not that, or that is specific to their ecosystem, or that would apply to one chain but not the other chain. I don't want to use specific names. And so it's up to the chain. We want to have as much continuity as possible at the federal level, but then give the chains as much autonomy and agency as possible at the individual level. And so it's up to the chains, but there's different models they can use as to how they want to participate in Optimism Governance or at the federal level. So they can just like appoint somebody to be their delegate representative. We have maybe about 20 chains involved in OP governance right now. Or when I say chains, what I mean is like chains that have a delegate. So that can just be appointed by somebody. You could, if your chain has its own token, like Uni, for example, you could use that token to have the uni holders elect their representative in Optimism Governance. Or you could do kind of the most the way that you would have the community most involved in the governance process is you could use your governance, you could replicate the Optimism votes in your own system, and then use your own local token and say, okay, all of the XYZ token holders voted this way, so we're going to cast our OP according to like that outcome. And this is a choice that's totally up to the chains. A lot of chains don't have their own tokens right now. So more commonly what we've seen is that they appoint a delegate because they don't have their own kind of token voted, their own governance system to decide the outcome in a different way. But I think over time we'll see more of that as more ecosystems like explore having their own governance systems.
Right. You said there's 20 chains involved in OP governance. Out of how many total within the Superchain ecosystem is that?
Yeah, I don't know what the what the total number is because it changes very frequently.
Right.
The reason that we have that many chains involved in governance is partially because we have a program called the Chain Delegation Program that supports, I think it's supporting 16 of those chains. And it basically temporarily delegates some tokens from the shared treasury to chains that are joining the ecosystem, and they meet some kind of requirements around how much revenue they're contributing, how much transaction volume there is. And the idea is to help them basically onboard to governance and bootstrap their own delegation. And so that's how we've gotten a lot of chains involved. They're excited. They're all in a chat together so that we can help onboard them. And then some other big chains have just gotten involved because it's very important to them, and they're maybe more involved in the core development process or something like that. But over time, we would expect a lot of the governance system to be kind of comprised of chains because they have super aligned incentives, and that like benefits them if the whole super chain succeeds. And they tend to care deeply about the protocol upgrade process since they're literally running their ecosystems on that stack. And they have just like a lot of knowledge and context to make some of the strategic decisions. So we think that we'll see a shift over time towards chains being kind of a bigger constituency, you could call it, in the governance system, but we also don't know how it will play out.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think on that front, kind of incentivizing chains and like explaining why this is important to them, because it affects them in the long run, is super important. And you also touched on before the two separate voting models that exist with Optimism's governance. Has a unique design. One is the token weighted voting, right? And then the other is like one person, one vote. Correct me if I'm right. You're nodding.
So, that's right.
Yeah, I've got it. Okay. Aside from the obvious of balancing power, why do you think this form is important and this model is working? Question mark.
Yeah.
Working.
Okay. Okay, so there's a few reasons that the system is designed this way, and one is what we call capture resistance, just so that one big whale can't come in and all of a sudden be in charge of everything. The other thing is a lot of governance systems apply kind of like one voting mechanism to all decisions, and it can look like direct democracy, representative democracy, token weighted voting, one member, one vote. Usually a system will pick one of those and just apply it everywhere. And it doesn't really make sense. That's not how we actually make decisions, right? We use different models, mental models, to make different decisions. And so part of the design of our system is token weighted voting is actually not always bad. Like it gets a bad rap for a lot of reasons. But if you have more decisions that need economic incentives, then it probably makes sense there. But you probably also have more of a short-term optimization because you're a large token holder, basically. So that makes sense for a certain type of decision, probably more around managing the treasury or other economic types of questions. You also have decisions where you don't want a short-term outlook and you don't want it to be economically motivated. It's super important to the sustainability of the system. And so in those places, we have a one member, one vote model.
Okay.
And yeah, so that's like kind of the basic idea. One is around just preventing governance attacks that we see in token weighted voting, but the other is around like how do we actually make the best decisions, and probably different types of voting for different types of decisions.
Mm-hmm. In regards to that, I was going to say, I feel like a lot of people are very economically driven within the broader crypto ecosystem. And so when it comes to thinking more long term, can you kind of tell us about like the process there in regards to shaping the roadmap for that and the intents of the ecosystem, and making sure that when people are voting on that side of the spectrum, that it is more long term thinking and not just about like the short term economic benefits?
Yeah, so part of that is that those types of questions also have to be approved by the one member, one vote system. So you have, even if you had the exact same participants in the token weighted system and in the one member, one vote system, you would get a very different outcome, right? Because some of those people are more heavily represented in the token weighted system, but they're equally represented in the one member, one vote system. And so that's part of it. For now, usually it's the foundation that proposes what our North Star is, or what we call intent, which is just like what is the main strategic goal or outcome that we're trying to achieve in the next 6 or 12 months. So we have the context and obviously like incentivize for long-term sustainability, but it's really that both of the voting types have to approve that. And so if it was just optimizing for a short term, or to, increase the value of the treasury, or some kind of short-term function, the one member, one vote system should not approve that, and then it wouldn't move forward, and they would have to come to some new version of the proposal that better balanced both the short term and the long term.
Mm-hmm. There's also the council model. Can you kind of tell us more about this and what benefits that brought to the governance process?
Yeah, we use the council model in the token weighted system, and not in the one member, one vote system. The reason that we introduced it was, in the beginning, we had everybody voting on everything, which we know is a failure mode.
Yeah.
So it was like delegates were voting on individual grant applications, and they had to vote on like 36 proposals every 3 weeks, and it was a circus basically.
Mm-hmm.
And so we introduced the idea of a council, which would be like, for all token holders, instead of voting on each grant application, why don't you just vote to elect a representative that will do this on your behalf? And so that's how the council model started, with the Grants Council. We have, I think, 4 or 5 councils right now, and we know from the research that we've done that the collective probably can't support any more. So the council model can be a really efficient way to make decisions when you need expertise, or when they're what's called a convex type of decision, which is basically like one that does not benefit from the wisdom of the crowds. There are certain questions that benefit from many people guessing what the answer might be. Like the famous one is like, how many jelly beans are in this jar? Yeah. The more people get that guess, the closer you're going to get to the answer. But a question like, what should the North Star of the collective be, or should this grant applicant receive this grant to run this specific type of incentives program, does not benefit from a lot of people that don't have context guessing on that. And so if it's that type of decision, we tend to delegate it to smaller groups of experts. And that's what we use the council model for. The vision is that we never have more than like 4 or 5 councils, and that over time, they don't exist forever, basically. They're kind of meant to be there to bootstrap a function, and then figure out how to replace themselves, either by putting that function on chain or by automating it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that makes sense. And then I know we talked about, or earlier on, you touched on the retro funding model, and Optimism is pretty well known for it. And essentially, it operates as a primary motor for the collective and a flywheel that supports contributions. Can you kind of break down how you see it differing from traditional funding models and what's being done to grow on this front and kind of expand retro funding in like coming seasons, I believe is what we
Yeah.
call it.
Yeah. We call, we run what we call seasons every
Mhm.
6 months. You could also just, like in a corporation, you would just call it like first half 2025 or second half. But we call it seasons. The reason we do that is it gives us like a fixed time box to try things. And so if we do an experiment or we introduce a new functionality, we'll do it for the season, and then we can reevaluate and say, oh, that was a disaster, we're not doing that again, or that was really good. What does V2 look like? So
Mhm.
it also just puts like our kind of planning cycles on the 6 month cycle. So with retro funding, it's different from most other ecosystems and funding mechanisms in general, actually. Make predictions basically about what will be useful. And so they give the recipient some amount of resources upfront, based on the promise that they're going to build something that's useful, but we don't know in advance if it's useful. That's the way, I don't know, probably 95% of funding mechanisms work.
Mhm.
We have that. We have a grants council and we have a foundation growth team that does make proactive grants in that way, but it's a smaller part, or it's meant to be a smaller part of the system in the future. What we think would be more efficient is to measure the impact of what someone has built once they've already built it and then reward them after the fact. It presents the challenge of when you have proactive funding, your challenge is being really good at predicting things. For retro funding, we have to get really good at measuring impact, which is hard in different ways. They're both hard problems. And so a lot of the work to date has been experimenting and learning about how we measure that impact. And so in the beginning, we had individual people, voters, in this one member, one vote system, trying to basically provide their opinion and input into what they thought the impact was. So it was very like human-based and subjective. Over time, we've moved more towards like a metrics-driven approach with human in the loop, to try to measure the impact based on on-chain data that we have access to.
Mhm.
What we're doing now is then taking that a step further and making it more algorithmic. So a lot of our vision for the future of the governance system as a whole is that it be very data driven with humans in the loop. So you'll have a lot of the system kind of running on algorithms, and people can step in to provide input into like what they should optimize for, or to be able to override or slam the brakes on if
Yeah.
and when needed. And so the kind of first place where you see that very obvious direction is with retro funding in this current kind of season that we're in.
Mhm. What type of data are you keeping in mind then, and metrics that you're maybe having algorithms look for? And then, like, obviously, the human interloop comes in after the fact, as you mentioned, but what metrics are important to keep in mind, especially in regards to retro funding?
Yeah, it's so we're working with a company called Open Source Observer on this. So they're the experts on the data. They're building this infrastructure, and all the kind of data and algorithms will be open source. I think the algorithms are not open source until after we're done running them, because you can game them, and and there's other attack vectors there. The type of data that's useful depends on the type of impact we're trying to reward. So right now we're rewarding developer tooling and on-chain builders. And so there's a lot of on-chain data you can look at, like transaction volume or gas fees, or I mean, there's many metrics to choose from
Mhm.
to look at the impact of on-chain builders. For developer tooling, it's different. And so you need more human inputs to kind of measure what the value of those different tools are. And so how you measure impact and what the algorithm looks like will also depend based on the kind of type of impact or contribution that you're trying to reward. So that's one place where human input will be very important. Another place is that they actually vote on the algorithm. So this past round, we had 3 different algorithms that this algorithm favors smaller, newer projects over established projects or something like that. And the voters can decide which one of those algorithms aligns more with their values or what they think the strategy should be. And then the final place is that while the algorithm's running, it needs to be kind of iteratively updated. And of course, we know Goodhart's law, which is as soon as the metrics or the algorithm is known, they stop being good targets because you can game it. And so you'll need humans kind of involved in that monitoring and constant kind of tweaking of the metrics or algorithm as it's running, basically, to make sure it's not being like, gamed or like bots. The rewards are not just going to a bunch of bots.
Right. No, that's not what we want. For the algorithms, though, so they change frequently then. That's a really smart point that they should change. If you could gamify it or you know what it's going to respond to, then you could just like basically like get through it very easily. But how frequently is it changing?
Yeah, so the way it's set up is that there's a vote on basically like the quote optimization target, or like what is the high level goal or direction that this algorithm is set up to go in. And then as long as that doesn't change, it can small updates and tweaks to prevent gaming and things like that, drift, etc., can be made. But if an update is going to be made where the like overall target is changed, then that's something that governance would have to vote on.
Okay. And then how do you specifically measure success for retro funding rounds, and what kind of improvements are being considered internally for the future?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll preface the fact that someone else on our team is responsible for retro funding, so I'm mostly just summarizing their work and their thoughts. But the way that we think about success of retro funding, I think there's two components to it. One is is our ability to measure impact getting better over time. That's a really important function just for the overall system, right? If we think that it's important for the system to efficiently allocate resources across the superchain, we need the ability to measure impact really well in order to be able to accomplish that, which also would just be a big improvement over most other governance systems, crypto or non-crypto. The second thing is is it a good experience for the builders that are relying on that mechanism to get to reward their contributions? So those are the two things that we think about. We've simplified the process for builders a lot. Something that's important for the builders is just the reliability and the predictability of what's going to be rewarded, how frequently it's going to be rewarded, and knowing what the amount of rewards they might receive is. In the beginning, it was highly, highly unpredictable. We did one retro funding round a year, and then we did one. Then we moved and we did more per year. We did 4, but they were rewarding dramatically different things. And so now we're trying to have a more consistent. Okay, for the next 6 months, this is what will be rewarded, and I think it's improving the experience for builders that are relying on this mechanism. The measurement, measuring impact, is kind of the second thing that we look at. I think you're seeing right now this experiment around the kind of algorithmic rewards. I think we're also very closely tracking an experiment that's being done outside our ecosystem called deep funding, which is also using algorithms, but kind of in a different way. We're, I would say, very much in the middle of, well, not in the middle, we kind of just started that experiment. And so we're in the observe and learn phase that will inform what the kind of next iteration looks like. So I think I can't say that we necessarily know exactly what the next iteration looks like, but we're trying to figure out how do we move towards a simplified builder and developer experience and a more accurate measurement of impact, and relying on data and algorithms where we can, and then making sure that the human input is incorporated where it's important.
I think with that said, I'm curious, what would you hope to see in the future from the retro funding missions on both the dev tooling side and for on-chain builders?
Yeah, ideally we get to the point where there's just kind of like an algorithm of some type. I don't know exactly how it will look, running in the background. And so builder, it's like in some sort of steady state. So it's not changing dramatically. And builders are getting kind of like regular payouts based on that. I think we just moved to monthly payouts. And so that creates like a really consistent, predictable experience for builders. And it just requires like a really robust kind of data infrastructure. We talk a lot about this dependency graph or the value chain, which is basically a mapping of the utility and dependencies of different contributions to the ecosystem and how they relate to each other. And so if we can build out like a really robust dependency graph and map out that value chain really well, we'll be in a very good position to measure most of the impact that's happening in the ecosystem. Right now, we're taking the approach of like, okay, let's just focus on stuff that's really measurable, like on-chain builders or dev tooling. But there's a lot of stuff happening in the ecosystem that doesn't fit in those categories. And so we need to gradually expand over time so that we're encompassing kind of all or most of the work that's being done. Whereas right now we're trying to get really good at measuring like a very thin sliver and then gradually add more slivers.
Mm-hmm. In terms of measurement, you've been in this space for a little while watching things. What has impacted from retrofunding so far in regards to builders and contributors within the ecosystem? Are there any like big winners or ripple effects you could point to as a result of all this?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely some projects that have sent messages or made public statements that they're only able to continue building or survive really because they received retro funding. There's another category of builders that have that were maybe considering like a closed source business model, but decided not to pursue that and instead remain basically an open source public good because of the validation and the rewards that they got through retro funding. And then I think we've also just seen other ecosystems experiment with this mechanism. So I don't know if my whole team agrees with it, but I think what would be cool in the future is if we saw like the individual OP chains start running their own retro funding rounds within their ecosystem, right? For their more local grant programs or something. And then you kind of just multiply that mechanism and that impact. And so that would be a cool ripple effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're allowed to share like what you would like.
It's my personal.
We have you on today, right? And I also wanted to talk about futarchy. Am I saying that correctly? Futarchy?
Yeah, futarchy, yeah.
Futarchy. Okay. Well, that's why I asked the questions, and you're the expert on this side of things. But in regards to futarchy, which was recently introduced, in terms of governance, can you kind of explain the core idea behind it in very simple terms for those who aren't aware of it yet? And then why Optimism believes this is an effective route forward?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, futarchy is like a big, fancy, scary word. But really what it is just it's a mechanism that allows people to bet on what they think an outcome will be. So you can use this for many things. You see, we saw a lot of examples of futarchy happening around the election. So people would bet if they, in the US, if they thought that Trump or Biden was going to win, and you could kind of follow that market and see, you can basically calculate probabilities based on that. Mm-hmm. The reason that it's interesting is we talked a lot about retro funding and measuring impact, but we also talked about how there's a part of the system where you will always need to predict what will be useful. And so futarchy is a way to make predictions that can be more data driven. So it's similar to the push that we're making in retro funding to become more data driven and algorithmic. We're exploring whether or not futarchy is a good mechanism to do a similar thing, but in making predictions. So what are like the type of predictions that we might make with Optimism Governance? It can be anything from like, what should the North Star be? What should our intent or goal be? To like, who should get a grant, or what should the budget for next year be? Okay. And so we've done an initial experiment where the prediction being made was which of these grant or which of these projects do you think will drive the most TVL between now and June, which is the end of our season, or the end of the first half. And so we had what we call forecasters sign up, and they all made different predictions about what the change in TVL for each project would be. And then the projects that had the highest, where people predicted the highest change in TVL, the top 5 of those received a grant. And then we will measure what the actual change in TVL was in June. And so that's, there's 2 elements of our experiment that are a little different, that are interesting. One is that we actually made a decision based on the predictions. And so in the example of like the presidential election, if you're betting that Trump is going to win, the outcome of the election is not based on your prediction that you made. But in our case, somebody bet that some project will increase TVL by, I don't know, 20 million between now and June, and they actually receive a grant based on that.
So the person who guesses that receives the grant, or the project that hits that metric?
Yeah.
Yes.
In
I was
June,
gonna say, that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah. In June, we'll measure the actual change in TVL, and then whoever made the most accurate forecasts will receive rewards. So there's a benefit for both the projects and the forecasters. What's useful about this experiment is that we have the ability to actually measure. So there's there's a definitive outcome, and we can say, you were good at forecasting, or you were bad at forecasting.
Okay. What are some of the biggest actionable items you're hoping to get answered or measure through this experiment?
It's we're looking at the different ways to make predictions and which are most accurate. And it's possible that the answer to that question is different depending on the prediction. So for example, now, how do we make predictions? Well, we can have everybody vote and just guess. We can delegate them to a group of experts. You can think of this as like super forecasters for people who have read that book. That's like what the grants council we have now. You can have a prediction market, or you can use an algorithm, basically. And so we're trying to understand which of these are the most effective ways to make which types of predictions, and then we can build that into our governance system where it's going to result kind of in the most accurate prediction.
Okay, that makes sense. And if it's successful long term, how do you think this could kind of change governance, not just for Optimism, but then the broader crypto space and other entities that are also going down this more decentralized governance model?
Yeah. So one benefit of it is a lot of times right now predictions are delegated to a small group of experts. With Futarchy, you can have more people participate. It's permissionless, basically. So more people are involved, and it's quote a more decentralized model. The other thing it allows us to do, which is hard right now, is to measure accuracy. And so you can then say, oh, these 10 token holders are really good at making predictions, and so they should basically have more weight in a decision, or the ability to make a decision, because we have a proven on-chain track record that they're really good at doing this. And that's otherwise pretty hard to measure, or just not measured in governance systems. And then the final thing is it can just be kind of running in the background and people are participating, and the market is kind of constantly updating based on people's predictions over time. And so one of our main goals with our governance system is what we call governance minimization, and is to make it run as effectively as possible with as little kind of active input or oversight from participants as possible. We're not there yet. Most governance systems, definitely including ours right now, are really complicated. It's hard to figure out what's going on. You're asked to vote on things a lot. It's a pretty big time commitment to be up to speed and participate in a meaningful way. And we want to get to the point where that's really not true, where there's kind of a baseline level of whether it's markets or algorithms or defaults running, and then you can come in and say, oh, hey, this is going off track, or I think we need to adjust in this way. But it only requires, I don't know, ideally half an hour of your time every quarter. Whereas now I think it realistically requires, I don't know, 10 hours a week or something to know what's going on.
Yeah, 10 hours is a lot. Even I feel like 30 minutes isn't a lot, but incentivizing people to want to be a part of it is like the key here, right?
Yeah, I think it's really important in terms of who the participants in the ecosystem are. I think there's a lot of efforts in general in crypto governance systems to try to create those incentives for people that otherwise don't have those incentives to participate. So it looks like paying people to vote, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we need to think more about like who is intrinsically motivated to show up and care about this, and how do we get them involved? That seems like the more sustainable, kind of better for the system in the long run approach.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also hard, and we're doing a lot of user research and interviews and conversations to understand from different types of stakeholders, like why do you or don't you participate in governance, what would need to change in order for you to provide your input, and it's very like exploratory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You've been in the optimism governance side of things for a little while now, and obviously things have evolved. You've tested out different experiments. I'm curious, what have been some of the biggest learnings from the different experiments and models that you've run and participated in? Or maybe
Yeah,
like participated, but also like overseen.
I think one of the biggest ones in everything we've done is just like simplify. It's really easy to come up with like a very complex solution,
Right.
a somewhat simple problem. And what we want to do is come up with simple solutions to like very complicated problems. So when you have a system that like thousands of people with different backgrounds and different levels of context need to interact with, you need the like simplest, cleanest,
Mm-hmm.
most MVP version of that thing. So that's definitely something that we've learned. We had more complicated things in the beginning, and we got rid of them.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other one is like really thinking about where we can kind of automate and set up some like defaults in the system to just shrink the governance surface area, because asking everybody to vote on every decision is just like cognitive overload for everybody. And what we've been finding is that people don't necessarily care about being involved in each decision. What they want is the ability to step in when they disagree with a decision and protest that decision, basically. And so that's another learning, is like how actively can people participate, and do they want to participate versus do they really just want the ability to have the ability to protest
Mm-hmm.
or have an emergency break if something's like really going off the rails in their opinion. I think the other thing we've thought a lot about and learned is like, where should we be measuring things? Where should we try to be making accurate predictions? And then where should we just be asking like humans, individuals, what their values are?
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of, as we think about shrinking the governance surface area and having things be more data driven and automated, it kind of results in the main input that we ask voters for is around their values, which is a question that only humans can answer.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I would say those are kind of the main things that we've learned over time.
Yeah. And then looking to the future of governance long term for Optimism and the Superchain, where do you see that going? What would you like to see? And then what about for the broader ecosystem? So,
Yeah, I think we want to get to the point where we have the people that are impacted by the decisions that Optimism Governance makes represented in the decision-making process. What exactly that looks like, we don't know, because it changes over time. But for sure, in regards to the Superchain, it's kind of like that the main contributors to the Superchain have influence on the decisions being made, so that those decisions can be made in the collective interest, which is like an easy thing to say, but most decisions are made in the individual interest of somebody who has imbalanced power in that decision-making process. I would love to see it be really reduced, the governance surface area. So I would love for it to be very data driven and kind of like running in the background. And then humans are called upon infrequently to to provide input on their values, or to say, I actually disagree with this decision, or we need to revisit this decision and call a vote on it. But it's a very different system from them being asked every 3 weeks to explicitly decide on 12 different things.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the third thing is that what's really important is that the system is accomplishing the strategic goals or outcomes that the main contributors to the ecosystem care about. So we mentioned growth, innovation, and security, but basically that the system can accomplish the things that are important to the OP chain or to the Superchain more broadly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Last thing, Levon, can you leave us with a piece of advice or something for those who want to build better governing systems? What would your advice be?
I think we need new approaches, is what I would say. I think what we see a lot is people trying to take something that's really broken and then like optimize it, or like, how can I make this thing that doesn't really work better? And I think what we need is, that approach doesn't work. Let's go back to first principles, and what is an alternative that we might try that might work better? So I see a lot of like putting band-aids on things that are, you're going to need a lot of band-aids to get that thing to work, as opposed to just like, let's just try something totally different and see if that works better.
100%. I think that could apply to many things beyond governance. Yeah. Amazing. Well, Levon, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. And thank you to everyone for listening in.
Great. Thanks for having me.